muri kumwe na Sixbert Musangamfura kuri radio televiziyo Ishakwe. Now I invite journalist Michaela Rong to open the microphone. I think it's open.
I think it's already open. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you nicely.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's very nice to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. I know you're going to be talking to a lot of people that I've spoken to over the years, and it's good to see Theogene, and I'm delighted to see Siri will also be talking. And thank you for inviting me. Just for the record, I'm not a doctor, but anyway, I'm just a normal person. But so many interesting things to say. I just wanted to relay a conversation I had when I was in South Africa promoting my book, Do Not Disturb, recently. And I met with a South African foreign ministry official. And I had gone on in public and I had been interviewed saying that I thought it was time that the South Africans stopped giving their natural place as a key African country, and in fact as a moral kind of bastion of the African continent, and stopped ceding that place to Paul Kagame, because that was the way I saw it, that increasingly it seems to me that anyone who is remotely interested in Africa, all they ever see is Paul Kagame making these high-profile initiatives and making these statements and being feted and quoted and interviewed. And I was saying, why is that the case? You know, Rwanda is a very small country with only 13 million people. Why isn't that South Africa, which has this, amazing history of ethnic reconciliation, if we can put it that way, and the end of apartheid, and this sort of the figure of Nelson Mandela is still one that people remember. And the when I raised that issue with the South African official, his response was to shrug his shoulders and to say, well, what can we do? Kagame is so popular in the West, and he's so popular we can't do anything about it. And I was very frustrated by that answer, because my response to him was, the West is looking to Africa for African solutions to African problems, and the idea that Africa then looks to the West and responds to the initiatives and policies of someone like Paul Kagame by saying, well, what can we do? The West, is so supportive of him. It means we are locked into a vicious circle, with the West looking at Africa to take the lead and Africa looking to the West. And I personally think it is for African countries to make their position on some of these issues clear, and then the West will take guidance and will take their cue from what people like Cyril Ramaphosa says on, for example, Rwanda's track record of transnational repression, and on, for example, Rwanda's record of destabilizing the Great Lakes region. So, having said that, I was asked to talk a bit about, why it is that international partners and Western partners don't stand up more and aren't more outspoken on the issue on Rwanda. I think historically, I think guilt was always a big factor. The awareness that the international community had not done anything once the genocide started. In fact, the UN actually pulled out peacekeepers at that stage, and Theogene knows better than anyone how the RPF elite used that guilt to silence dissent in the West, and to sort of, and you see Kagame doing this all the time. Whenever he's criticized for human rights abuses, you see him sort of saying, how dare you tell us, how dare you give us any lessons on human rights? Where were you when the genocide exploded? So the guilt card is still there. It's a very strong card. It still continues to be played. But I think as just as strong as that card is, the development narrative, the development model card is the second card that continues to be played. We've all seen this, and we've seen this in the build-up to CHOGM, that everyone is talking about growth rates, everyone talking about development indicators, primary schools, the fantastic, the way that Kigali looks so fantastic as a city, the women in parliament, the ratio of women in parliament, the track record on vaccinations, those kind of things. And this is a very, very strong card. And I think that sometimes my feeling is that Rwandans who are critical of the regime don't realize how effective this card is in silencing criticism of Paul Kagame's government. And I think they should become more interested in that debate. I know obviously David Himbara writes about it all the time, but I sometimes see a bit of a silence on those issues. There's a lot of scrutiny now on key indicators. For example, there was a very interesting paper written about the supposed green revolution that Rwanda had experienced. It turns out, thanks to this young man called Sebastian Heinen, who's written a paper on the topic for SOAS, it turns out that wasn't a green revolution. That was 15 years of stagnating agricultural output. And I think that, when you burrow down and when you scratch at these figures, they're often impressive figures, but they are not the miracle that any of us have been told, and they are not the miracle that is being presented to the international community and that lazily the international community allows to take hold. So I think that I would like to see Rwandans who are unhappy about Paul Kagame's human rights record taking more of an interest in that side of things, because sometimes I feel that the fact that the development success story is nothing like as impressive as it's presented, I think that is neglected by Rwandans, and they only talk about human rights abuses, but this is a factor in the shining reputation of Paul Kagame's regime. And I think if you are going to get people to be more critical and more concerned about human rights, you first have to make it clear that yes, this is an impressively run modern African state, but it's not a miracle, and that in any case, development achievements do not make up for glaring human rights abuses. But finally, the obvious other card that is being played now is the usefulness card, the indispensability card. So Theogenes was just talking about the way in which, the sending of peacekeepers, the mercenary role effectively that the Rwanda is now fulfilling, these very impressive, well-disciplined, well-trained troops that are being sent around into Africa to places that no Western government will ever send Western troops. This is a very effective card, and again, it persuades foreign partners to be a little less critical on the human rights front, because they are so glad that no one wants them to send their armies to places like Cabo Delgado or Central African Republic or Mali. So the other element now, which we're seeing, which is a really curious, interesting aspect of this usefulness and indispensability card, is the using of Western concern, Western paranoia about immigration, and using that to offer Rwanda services, and the fact that Rwanda is very clearly a completely inappropriate place to send any excess asylum seekers is somehow forgotten, because Denmark is now talking about a similar deal to the British deal. The Brits are just so grateful. And I think, what we have seen in the last few weeks is the way in which all the criticisms that were voiced by the British officials who were present at the UN Universal Human Rights peer review process in Geneva that was staged last year. British officials were very unexpectedly outspoken about Rwanda's record on extrajudicial killings, disappearances, torture in detention. And all of that is now forgotten because Boris Johnson and Priti Patel are talking about this safe haven, this wonderful paradise where they want to send asylum seekers. So it's a very cynical arrangement, but I'm afraid that we may see more of this. I gather that the Danish are very keen on this kind of arrangement. And immigration is a massive concern in the West at the moment. So I think these are all the factors when when people wonder, why is there so little criticism of Paul Kagame in the West? These are the factors. And then the other main factor is never, ever, ever underestimate how ignorant most policymakers, most ordinary citizens, most voters in the West are about Rwanda and about African history. I, as somebody who's spent now nearly 30 years writing about Africa's current affairs and African history, I'm constantly stunned by the really, really low level of knowledge. And I would say that there are only two things that people know about Rwanda. One is that it had a genocide. Maybe there's three things. One, it had a genocide. Second, Paul Kagame ended the genocide. Any nuance of that maybe he inadvertently started it, is forgotten. And then the third thing is that it's a development miracle. So those are the three things. And you're dealing with that level of really basic ignorance and just that sort of that framework. I think when you're dealing with that kind of scenario, one of the things to bear in mind is also, sorry, I meant to say this earlier, Rwanda convinces people very well, in part because it spends tens of thousands of dollars or pounds every month getting its message across. And we've seen, for example, with the Rusesabagina case, and I gather that the same company is being used now in the run-up to Chogam, the use of the company Chelgate, which is a PR and reputation management company here in Britain, in London, advising the Rwandans on how to be convincing, how to present their case. We have seen in the past other companies of this kind. I was just reading recently a contract signed between something called Myriad, which has signed a deal with the Rwanda Development Board in the States, and they are going to be doing all the promotion for Rwanda's tourism industry, where a lot of energy seems to be going into that. And in the past, we've seen other companies signing incredibly expensive contracts with the Rwandan government. And I do find it astonishingly inappropriate that a government that is receiving so much money from foreign aid donors feels that it can afford to spend this kind of money on PR. But we have to acknowledge that it's an investment that pays off, because at every step of the way, as a journalist, I am so impressed by the way in which Rwanda manages to get its message across, the way in which Rwanda is so skilled at identifying the sort of hot buttons to press that work here in the West, and how they present their case. Often, when I'm listening to Yolanda Makolo recently giving press conferences, you can see that she's using exactly the same language. She's a very skilled operator. She's very smooth. She's using exactly the same vocabulary and terminology as the British government is using in justifying and explaining its policy on asylum seekers. So I suspect that Chelgate has helped, prepare that response. The very fact, for example, that Yolanda Makolo staged a press conference, a tool where all British journalists were invited recently to discuss Chogam and the refugee deal. Again, it's not clear to me that that's a very common occurrence, Yolanda Makolo staging a press conference in Kigali. But, if you're a Western journalist, you expect press conferences to be staged. So it was very important that they did that. So, and I'm sure that Chelgate will have explained to them, now you have to give a press conference, and this is a terminology to use, because it's exactly the same terminology is being used in Whitehall in London. So they're getting excellent advice, and they're putting it to very effective use. And part of that advice, by the way, will concern sports washing. This is, again, an African government I have never seen the like, that goes in for what we call sports washing, which is whitewashing done through sports. And people have talked a lot about the Arsenal deal, but of course that's only one of the deals that the Rwandans have signed. So they have also got a similar deal with Paris Saint-Germain, the French soccer team. And you can also see there's a lot of collaboration on basketball. You know, the NBA and Rwanda seem to be in constant contact with one another. There's also been a lot of collaboration on the hosting of various bicycling championships. So again, and I suspect this is where companies like Shellgate are earning their money, and they're pointing out how sports can be used by a government which doesn't have a good human rights record to whitewash over that fact. So I suppose one of the questions is, how does one deal with this? If you're in the opposition and you feel that your arguments just aren't being heard, how does one deal with that level of professionalism and spending? Because, of course, no opposition movement or no human rights movement has got that kind of money to spend, because effectively that is diverted aid money that is being spent on these kind of contracts, and it will be in the millions. You know, it'll amount to millions of dollars every year. I think you have to be smart, agile, and available. And I think one of the frustrations I found as a writer writing "Do Not Disturb" was how often people did not want to be quoted. And I'm very, very, very grateful to any Rwandan who was willing to be quoted, because I understand the reasons for that reluctance. But it does make it difficult for people like me when people don't want to be quoted. And so, you know, I think sometimes you get people who have started new lives abroad. They don't want to get involved in politics. They have had lots of very important and often shocking experiences, but they are so tired and disillusioned and upset by the whole experience that they really just don't want to talk about it. And I would say to those people, if you have no reason to think you're going to be going back, and if you don't have dependents back in Rwanda, please talk to people like me and go on the record, because we can't do this job on our own. You know, I'm a white woman criticizing an African dictatorship, and I'm constantly being derided and abused as a racist. And that is always going to be an accusation hurled at me because of my skin color and because I don't live there, and I'm a Western, and I'll be accused of white privilege. So I'm afraid, you know, it does require people to step up to the plate and show this extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice and say, I will go on the record and I will criticize my government, even if it does involve a cost to me. I cannot leave it to outsiders like Michaela Wrong or like the various, you know, academics and other journalists who are voicing them. And in that struggle, I think it's very important, if you are going to speak out, and maybe, you know, if you're involved in a human rights organization or in a opposition party, I think it's very important to provide facts if you've got them. You know, I was talking earlier about the development record not being as impressive as people say. The reason I leap on a study that shows that the statistics are not as fantastic as is being claimed is because it's a solid fact. It is indisputable. The rest is opinion, and it can be, you know, argued over by all the social media trolls that we know the Rwandan government employs. But if you can present a report that actually shows the figures that undermine the idea that there was a green revolution, for example, or some other development claim, that's just an incontrovertible fact. So I would encourage people, when they are trying to sort of question the official narrative, to try and be as fact-based as possible and try and keep the passions to one side, because sometimes there's a lot of screaming, but you know, in the end, what will stick will be the factual analysis. So I think that's it. That's really what I want to. That's my presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions if people have them.
Thank you so much indeed, Mr. Arong, and I take this opportunity to correct you because I said you're a doctor.
I wish I were. I'm not like Theo J.
I think it will happen. It will happen. Yeah. Yes, please.
Oh, okay. I mean, obviously, I agree with so much of what Theogene has said. Definitely the answer has to come from Rwanda, because the West doesn't understand the situation. As I was saying earlier, one of the key problems is massive ignorance. And so the West either often doesn't understand what's happening in Rwanda or the Great Lakes region, and when it reacts too late, and it's often reacting to things that happened a long time ago. And also it has its own interests. And I think one of the things I find quite interesting is watching Kagame suddenly, Theogene was talking about this, Kagame has suddenly become the new best friend of the French. I mean, I'm sure he never for a moment thinks that is a friendship or an alliance that is for African governments and African leaders. It's very personalized often. It tends to be fixed on one man. And also it can change in a moment. And we saw this in Uganda, for example, when Museveni took power in 1986, and the West had gone from thinking he was a Marxist rebel and a threat to democracy, and suddenly everyone was doing business with him. The World Bank went in there, the IMF wanted to lend money to him, and there is always a realization in the West of this is the new setup, this is the new scenario, and we need to do terms with the new people in town. The new guys on the block, we will do terms with them. So there is no constancy and there is no loyalty. And I'm sure Kagame is aware of that, and he plays the same game. The answer to Rwanda's crisis and predicament will definitely come from Rwanda, from inside Rwanda. And the West will be playing catch up, and that is the way it should be. The one thing I would say is I do think what I find very frustrating at the moment is you have, on the one hand, you have officially a discourse which suggests that the wounds of the past are being tackled. For example, no one is supposed to say whether they're Hutu or Tutsi or Twa anymore, and no identity cards exist of the kind we had in the past. And I think that would be marvellous and wonderful if only it were then also supported by the speeches that people in positions of power give in Rwanda, and by the policy on every front. And instead what you see is that's the policy on ethnic identification and reconciliation, but in fact there's a constant push to remind people of all the factors that led to the genocide and also led to the killings of the RPF. So there is a deliberate desire to keep those toxic hatreds going, because those toxic hatreds and the fear that they have created in the Tutsi community helps to keep Kagame in power. So he needs that fear. And, I think later on, I hope you'll be able to hear from René Le Marchand, Professor René Le Marchand, who knows far better than I do that the situation, this relationship between majority and minority is not a new event. It doesn't date back to the 1990s. It goes way back further than that. And Rwanda is going to have to deal with that relationship and those issues. And the tragedy of Rwanda today, it seems to me, is that the government is not at all sincere in trying to address that relationship and the problems they're in. In fact, if anything, I believe it is fermenting them. And we see that, every April, when you see this sort of commemoration, it is a commemoration for the dead, but it is also reminding for both communities of how appallingly they treated one another, and it keeps the fear going and keeps the hostility going. So that the very event, that mourning, what should be a purging process, seems to me it just makes the whole experience much, much worse. So anyway, but that's all I have really to add to what Theogene said.
Yeah, thank you so much for your intervention, Kirarong. From Mrs. Siri Sendashonga. She has written. Yeah, maybe you can read it on your screen as well.
Yeah, I can read the question.
Yes,
She says,
yes.
"Is there anything I would do differently 1 year after publication?" That's a very good question. I mean, I think if you are the writer of a book, you are constantly adjusting and correcting and changing the book before you go to press. I wish when I was writing the book that I had been more aware of a lot of the evidence and testimony of Hutus who, were living in the north and experienced the killings by the RPF before the genocide, because I think a lot of testimony has come out about that since my book came out, or since it was, because before your book is printed for about 6 months you cannot change it. It has gone off to the printers. So I wish that those testimonies had been more available, because I think I would have included more material from those. I mean, obviously there are phrases that have been picked up on by the trolls, and I mean, as you're well aware, I've been accused of having had a sexual relationship with Patrick Karagaya, taking money from the Ugandan intelligence. And sometimes, you look at the way they fixate on certain phrases and you think, well, I wish I hadn't put that in. And then you sort of think, but if it hadn't been that phrase, it would have been something else. Because what you see with anyone who is criticizing the government, they will go in for, they will never address the substance of the criticism, which in my book is mostly transnational repression practiced by the Rwandan regime. They will never address those. They will always go for attacking the writer personally, and they make it very, very personal. So that's been, that's the way they've got to me, because, that was what they decided was the most effective way. She's a woman, so let's accuse her of having had sexual adventures, and let's accuse her of taking money. We won't be able to prove either of these things because they're untrue, but that's what we're going to say. So, I mean, sometimes you think, oh, well, if I had to phrase things differently, but then you think, well, as I say, you sort of think it would have been something else, because these trolls are paid to do that. I am paid to write articles, so I use Twitter probably once or twice a day. These are people who are being paid to besmirch, smear, defame anyone attacking the government, and that's their full-time job. So they work very hard for their money. So I feel in a way there's not much point sort of working out which particular phrase or which particular passage was the issue, but you should feel free to disagree with me, Siri.